So out of nowhere, EK quietly released these fans right here, the 38mm thick Meltemi. For reference, the standard 120mm fan thickness is 25mm, and we usually see slim fans come in at just 15mm. This gives us the opportunity to do some pretty interesting testing. These are advertised as ultra high static pressure fans, so our testing today will be on a radiator, but I'm curious to see how these perform both in terms of thermal and noise performance versus Noctuas NFA 12x25 and also the regular thickness EK Vada Evas. So fan thickness is the metric that we're testing today, and whether these thicker fans from EK are actually better. That is to say, if you do have the additional 13mm of clearance on your radiator and fan setup, do you get improved thermal or noise performance by switching to these fans? That extra 13mm of clearance is an interesting number as well, because that's close enough to 15mm, which would allow you to just instead add a pair of slim fans. So that's a setup that we'll also be testing today. I'll be honest, I don't have the measuring tools to give you guys accurate measurements when it comes to the velocity of airflow through these fans or their static pressure, but I will list the specs right here before we look at our thermal and noise data. So just looking at these numbers here, keep in mind the airflow and static pressure values are at each fan's max RPM. So that's one reason that the EK Vada Evo outperforms the rest here by a decent margin. Worth noting, the EK Meltemi claims a slightly higher airflow and static pressure than Noctua's NFA 12x25, but at a slightly lower RPM. And a quick introduction on these Noctua fans and why I've included them in the testing today. These are by far the best 120mm fans that I've ever tested. In terms of thermal performance, you're not going to see a big discrepancy among the majority of decent 120mm fans, but where the NFA 12x25 really leads the pack is when it comes to noise performance. Basically, these fans are virtually silent at 1000 RPM. We'll take a look at that in just a second. So back to the EK Meltemi then. It's a really nice looking fan, really plain and stealthy, which I definitely appreciate. It basically looks just like a beefed up Vada fan, so if you're familiar with those, then this will look very similar. The cable is sleeved, which terminates at a 4-pin PWM header as you would expect, and thankfully you do get the longer radiator screws included here in the box. So in terms of testing, everything here was done on an open test bench with the ambient room temperature closely monitored for each test. For the sound level testing, the position of the test bench does not change, and both the SPL meter and the microphone are exactly 20 centimeters in front of the radiator fans. All fans have been tested on the Corsair H100i Platinum AIO, and the CPU for testing is kind of irrelevant, but it is a delidded 8700K overclocked to 4.8 GHz at 1.30 volts flat. So let's start off by looking at how much noise is generated from each pair of fans, starting with all of them set to a measly 500 RPM. This gives us an idea of how loud each fan is when your system is handling light workloads or just at idle. The noise floor here, that is the amount of noise in the room with the fans completely off, was measured at 35.4 dBA, and there honestly isn't that much of a difference between any of the fans here. I personally don't think that these differences are easy to perceive. The real test is the amount of noise generated at 1200 RPM, a much more moderate and realistic fan speed for your system at load. Unfortunately, we can see here that the 38mm thick EK Meltemi fans are just not quiet fans, and at 1200 RPM I measured them at 40.2 dBA versus the Noctua NFA 12x25 at a much more mellow 37.6 dBA. So in terms of noise, they are pretty typical standard 120mm fans. They're very similar to the standard thickness EK Vada Evos. And with all fans set to their respective max RPMs, here's what we're looking at. This test isn't too much of a practical one, seeing as not many of you will actually be planning to run your radiator fans at max RPM, but for what it's worth, these are the maximum noise levels that each fan has the potential to make. Again, nothing stand out here from the Meltemi fans, about what you would expect from a standard 120mm fan at 1800 RPM. Also, here's a quick audio test of all of the fans running at 1200 RPM and then also the max RPM to give you an idea of what they sound like. The thermal tests were where I was really hoping to see the Meltemi fans justify their existence, seeing as they are marketed as extremely high static pressure, but as we can see that just does not happen. With all fans spinning at 1500 RPM, the Meltemi fans actually performed the worst out of the stack, although we are talking about very low margins here. Still though, equating close enough for overall fan and radiator thickness, you would be better off going with a pair of standard thickness fans plus a pair of slim fans, where we do see a thermal improvement of almost 4 degrees C. The real test though is the CPU thermal test with all fans generating the same amount of noise, that is a noise normalized test. So here we are looking at the CPU thermals with all fans generating 40 dBA. All other fans in the stack manage the noise level spinning at around 1150 RPM, but the Noctua NFA 12x25s are the real standout here. They're able to run at over 1400 RPM, giving them a slight edge over the other fans in terms of thermals. To truly optimize your thermal performance at 40 dBA though, it really does seem like the best strategy is just to add more fans at a lower RPM, instead of just making the fans thicker. We're equating for a lot of variables here, and between the top and bottom result, we are equating for total fan and radiator thickness also, yet we see a 3-degree difference. Now with this test setup, we might only see a 3-degree difference between the top and bottom result, but if we were to test a triple fan setup on a 360mm rad, which was extracting more heat out of a stronger CPU, then that difference might grow to 6, 7, or 8 degrees or more. So although the 38mm thick Meltemi fans are marketed as a high static pressure, high performance fan, they just don't perform that great in terms of CPU thermals when tested on a radiator. The best strategy for cooling and noise performance is, if you do have the extra clearance, is just to add more fans, whether that's a pair of slim fans or standard fans, depends on your setup. So really don't buy the Meltemis, they don't perform better than other 120mm fans. I honestly don't know why EK released these, maybe they pushed too much R&D into the development of them and they just had to release them anyway. So the noise normalized test shows the Noctua NFA 12x25 is the superior fan here. If you are interested in lowering the noise of your system, you can check them out down below in the description. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching, consider subscribing down below if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.